When we talk about the deadliest killers in history, we picture tyrants, generals, dictators, men with armies and bombs. But sometimes the most ruthless killer can't be seen at all. No crown, no throne, just a microscopic twist of RNA drifting from a cough to a lung, from one continent to another, unstoppable as the wind. Tonight on Faces of History, we don't stare into the face of a king or a warlord. We stare into the empty eyes of a tiny killer. The Spanish flu of 1918, a virus that infected one-third of the world's population and killed more people than the guns of the Great War ever could. I'm the Duke of New York. Stay curious, stay brave. Let's begin. Before the cough, before the fever, before the headlines, the world in early 1918 was already bleeding. The Great War, the war to end all wars, had been grinding Europe's young men into the mud for nearly 4 years. Names like Verdun, the Somme, Passchendaele, words that once meant little, now spoke of hell on earth. Boys in muddy trenches traded rifle fire, poison gas, and bayonet charges for inches of ruined farmland. Mothers waited for telegrams that might never come. Fathers dug graves for sons they would never see come home. Factories thundered day and night, churning out shells and boots and rifles. Women worked the looms and lines while the men fought and died. Children ran barefoot through bombed-out streets, clutching ration cards instead of toys. This was a world living on borrowed time. And yet, life went on. Soldiers wrote letters home about Christmas dinners by candlelight in the trenches. Sweethearts pressed flowers into diaries, waiting for a knock at the door that might bring a uniform back to them, or not. In America, President Woodrow Wilson spoke of making the world safe for democracy, as the United States finally hurled its fresh boys into the European slaughterhouse. The trains clattered with farm boys from Kansas, Kentucky, and Ohio, wide-eyed, uniformed, clutching their kit bags and whispering prayers they'd half forgotten since Sunday school. In cities from Boston to Bombay, people lined up for sugar, coal, butter, anything that might be scarce tomorrow. Posters ordered men to enlist, women to work, families to sacrifice. Everyone gave something. Their sons, their savings, their hopes. They thought they knew what death looked like. They thought they'd seen the worst humanity could conjure: machine guns, chlorine gas, tanks that rolled like metal beasts across no man's land. They thought they'd counted the cost: 10 million dead in Europe's fields and forests and counting. But death was already packing its next weapon. A weapon that needed no bullets, no generals, no battle plan. Just lungs, millions of them. Just crowded troop trains, sweaty barracks, filthy trenches, cramped tenements. Perfect breeding grounds for a microscopic killer that didn't care who fired the first shot at Sarajevo. In the small hours of early 1918, somewhere in the middle of America, the killer stirred. Historians argue about where exactly it began. Maybe a farm in Kansas, maybe a British field hospital in France, maybe a Chinese labor camp on the Western Front. It doesn't really matter. What mattered was how easily it slipped past the borders we trusted. It looked harmless at first, just the flu. A cough, a chill, a fever. Doctors shrugged. They'd seen flu before. It came every winter, took the weak and left the strong. But this one was different. It jumped from man to man in days. Soldiers coughed over breakfast and lay gasping by nightfall. Medics wrapped their faces in gauze masks that did nothing to stop the tiny invader drifting through the air like smoke. A world with no vaccines, no antivirals, no antibiotics for the pneumonia that followed. The science of viruses didn't even exist yet. Scientists couldn't see them, couldn't isolate them. Germ theory was still young. Doctors bled patients, pumped their stomachs, fed them whiskey and folk cures, prayed. But the virus did not care for prayers. It found ships, troop transports packed with thousands of men sailing across the Atlantic to fight in France. If the war didn't kill them, the cough might. And when they reached Europe, they brought more than rifles. They brought an invisible army that marched faster than any general's orders. In the spring of 1918, the world thought it was seeing the end of one nightmare, and didn't yet see the next one gathering behind it. A world on the brink of victory. A world about to sign an armistice. A world that thought the worst was behind it and had no idea that the real horror was just taking its first breath in a Kansas barracks and a muddy trench in Flanders. This was the world before the Spanish flu, a world at war, a world exhausted, a world about to learn that some enemies don't come with bayonets and battle flags. They come on a sneeze, on a handshake, on a breeze through a crowded street, and when they come, they change everything. The virus with no flag. If war has a flag, disease does not. Kings and generals stamp their emblems on maps, but viruses drift wherever they please, crossing trenches, borders, and oceans without a passport, without a uniform. The Spanish flu of 1918 was just that, a killer that owed no loyalty to king or country, no debt to empire or creed. It belonged to no one, and yet it would come for everyone. It hitched a ride on greatest machines of death. Troop ships creaked across the Atlantic, stacked with soldiers crammed shoulder to shoulder below deck, coughing, sneezing, sweating through fevers. Those same ships brought guns and ammunition for the trenches. But deep in the hulls, invisible as stowaways, the virus multiplied in human lungs. One cough, one handshake, and it leapt to the next host. In the trenches of France and Belgium, rats ran over boots at night, lice bred in filthy uniforms. And now, a new predator slipped between men like smoke. Shellfire and poison gas drove men to huddle in dugouts where stale, damp air became a breeding ground. Soldiers learned to fear the hacking cough behind them as much as the sniper in front of them. London, Paris, Berlin, New York. The world's great engines of progress, railways, ports, trams, crowded streets, became veins and arteries for the virus to flow through. Porters lifted cargo and spread droplets into the humid air of train stations. Factory workers coughed into handkerchiefs. School children carried it home to mothers and grandfathers who had never set foot in a trench but would soon choke just the same. Why Spanish if it came from Kansas? Because Spain, neutral in the Great War, had no censors to hide the truth. In Britain, France, Germany, the United States, the press was muzzled. Leaders feared that news of a mysterious plague would crush morale. They told newspapers, print the victories, bury the deaths. A soldier might die on the battlefield, that was noble. A soldier might die in bed, drowning in his own lungs, that was shameful. Spain had no stake in the war's secrets, so when King Alfonso III fell sick, Spanish papers reported it. They reported the hospitals overflowing, the soldiers hacking up blood, the streets lined with black-draped hearses. The rest of the world blamed Spain. But the virus laughed at the map. It was already everywhere. Doctors knew something was wrong. They watched young, healthy men turn blue and die within days, or even hours. They called it purulent bronchitis, purple death, grip. They had no name for influenza that killed the strong and spared the weak. But the public didn't know. Soldiers were told to fight on. Workers were told to show up. Crowds gathered for war bond rallies. Parades marched down Main Street, brass bands echoing through crowds thick with the invisible killer. It was invisible and invincible for now. Under the microscope, a virus is just a ghost. Then, it was more ghost than ever, because in 1918, no scientist on Earth had ever actually seen a virus. They knew bacteria. They knew how to brew vaccines for smallpox and diphtheria. But influenza's true shape was a mystery. No petri dish, no microscope could reveal its secrets yet. Doctors bled patients to balance the humors. They prescribed quinine and brandy. They packed lungs with mustard poultices. They told the dying to pray. None of it worked. It was the first great global killer of the modern age, and it rode on modern miracles. Steamships, trains, telegraphs, trenches, factories. Everything that made the 20th century modern also gave the virus wings. In medieval times, a plague needed months to cross continents. In 1918, a virus needed only a troop train from Kansas to New York, a transport ship to Brest, a handshake in the trenches, and a generation was infected before they could see the shape of what hunted them. A virus with no flag, no mercy, and no plan but to survive by killing. It needed no allies, no propaganda, no political cause. It cared nothing for the songs men sang to keep their spirits up in the mud. It cared nothing for who wore which uniform. All it needed was a warm throat, a damp lung, a new host, and then the next. And so it moved. Kansas, New York, Liverpool, Brest, Paris, Berlin. A hidden army, an invisible empire. By the summer of 1918, it had crossed the trenches, infected the troops, slipped through the censors, and waited for the fall when it would reveal its true face. When the virus first stepped onto history's stage in spring 1918, it didn't roar. It whispered. The first wave came on a breeze that smelled of mud, gunpowder, and sweat. It found its first great gathering at places like Camp Funston, Kansas, an army training camp where nearly 50,000 young men drilled in tight ranks, ate elbow to elbow, and slept stacked in rows of bunks. On March 4th, 1918, a cook named Albert Gitchell reported sick with a fever, chills, and a headache. By noon, dozens more were down. By the next day, hundreds. Before the week was out, more than 1,000 men coughed in the infirmary. And just like that, a microbe's quiet war began. A curious flu, and yet not curious enough to panic. Most who fell ill recovered. It was nasty. A fever that hammered the joints, a cough that tore at the ribs, but not so deadly. Camp commanders chalked it up to overcrowding and spring sniffles. They kept the men drilling, kept them shipping out by the thousands. What was a cough compared to the guns of the Kaiser? But in barracks and mess halls, the virus was busy, copying itself, mutating, learning. Each infected lung was a fresh laboratory, each sneeze a new test run. It followed the men overseas. On crowded troop ships, seasick soldiers doubled over in hammocks, hacking and sweating. They disembarked in France, pale and glassy-eyed, then were thrown into the trenches to cough and sneeze among rats, mud, and strangers from a dozen countries. Within weeks, the first wave rolled through France's lines. German trenches felt it next. Enemies who shot at each other by day shared the same invisible killer by night. In April and May, it washed over Britain. Hospitals noticed something odd. The flu was striking young, fit soldiers, not just the old or the frail. Still, most survived. Newspapers that dared to whisper about it called it 3-day fever, a nuisance, not a threat. Cities got sick, but shrugged it off. Doctors blamed bad air, bad humors, bad luck. They prescribed bed rest, whiskey, chicken broth. Children missed school for a week, then returned pale but alive. Families buried the unlucky quietly and carried on. After all, death was already a daily guest. A telegram from the front could snatch a son, a brother, a father. Why fear a cough? And so the first wave passed. By summer 1918, the war was dragging toward its bloody finale. Millions dead, millions more wounded. Yet the virus seemed to slip back into the shadows, a ghost people half forgot, half dismissed. But inside human lungs, the virus was at work, changing its shape. Scientists now know what no doctor in 1918 could see. Influenza viruses are shapeshifters. They drift and shift, swapping genetic code like playing cards, testing which version will kill best. The first wave was a dress rehearsal, the virus softening us up, spreading itself far and wide, planting seeds in every city, every trench, every port. When the weather cooled, people would huddle together indoors. Armies would move again in great waves as offensives surged toward a brutal finish. Celebrations would bring crowds into the streets, and the virus would be waiting. Whispers would become screams. A disease that looked mild in spring would return in autumn like a hurricane in a coffin, faster, deadlier, hungry for lungs that had never seen anything like it. Some doctors saw it coming. They wrote worried letters. They pleaded for precautions, but most leaders shrugged them off. The war was the war. The soldiers must ship out, the people must work, the parades must march. What's a cough, they asked, compared to victory? What indeed? The first wave left the world infected and unsuspecting, the perfect trap. By the time people realized what they were up against, it would be too late to run, too late to hide, too late for prayers. The second wave was coming. If the first wave was a whisper, the second was a scream. It began in the closing days of summer 1918, when the air turned crisp, when families gathered indoors, when the Great War was grinding toward its final bloodbath. The virus that had been a nuisance in spring returned from its quiet summer vacation, but it came back meaner, faster, deadlier. Ground Zero, the crowded ports and camps where war refused to sleep. In August, sailors in the French port of Brest fell ill. This time the fever struck harder, the cough deeper. Within days, British ships in Freetown, Sierra Leone reported the same thing. Healthy men doubled over, gasping for air, their skin turning dusky blue. And then, like a spark hitting dry grass, the killer leapt the ocean again. Boston, September 1918. At the Boston Navy Yard, sailors staggered ashore feverish and delirious. Within days, barracks overflowed. Doctors watched helplessly as the same pattern repeated. A young man would cough one day, collapse the next, drown in his own lungs by the third. Camp Devens, just outside Boston, became a chamber of horrors. 30 miles from the city, it was home to 45,000 troops, a perfect petri dish. Army Doctor William Henry Welch arrived to find hallways lined with gasping men, some coughing up blood, some so blue they looked bruised. Autopsies revealed lungs so heavy with fluid they dripped pink foam onto the floor. This was no ordinary flu. Healthy young adults, the very people supposed to survive a normal flu, were now the first to die. Doctors were baffled. Many victims weren't killed directly by the virus, but by their own immune systems going berserk, a cytokine storm that shredded lung tissue in a desperate, suicidal defense. Bodies piled up faster than they could be buried. Coffins ran out. Local carpenters worked night and day. Families sealed windows with blankets, hoping to keep the invisible killer outside. The war machine kept turning. Despite the horror in Boston, soldiers kept shipping out. The army was pushing for one last offensive to break Germany's back. Camp Devens, Camp Upton, Camp Grant, all infected, all sending men to France by the tens of thousands. Sick men leaned over the rails of crowded troop ships, coughing into the sea, the same ships that delivered death to ports in New York, Halifax, Liverpool, and beyond. Then came Philadelphia, and the parade that wrote its own epitaph. On September 28, 1918, Philadelphia threw a grand Liberty Loan Parade to sell war bonds. Officials knew the flu was here. Local doctors begged them to cancel. But the city needed money for the war, so the bands marched. Sailors waved. Families crowded 10 deep along Broad Street. 200,000 people, shoulder to shoulder, shouting, laughing, singing. 3 days later, every hospital bed in Philadelphia was full. Within a week, corpses were stacked like firewood in tenements. Gravediggers couldn't keep up. Streetcars carried the sick to overwhelmed hospitals and brought the virus to every corner of the city. By the time Philadelphia's leaders begged people to stay indoors, it was too late. Block after block, windows were marked with bedsheets fluttering from upstairs bedrooms, a sign to passing doctors and priests that death had already called. The same pattern repeated around the world. In Boston, New York, Chicago, London, cities staggered under the weight of the second wave. In the mining towns of South Africa, in the crowded alleys of Bombay, in the rice paddies of China, anywhere people huddled together for warmth, work, or worship, the virus slipped through the cracks. Doctors wore gauze masks that did almost nothing. Some towns banned public gatherings, shut down schools and churches, closed pool halls and theaters. In other places, fear won out over reason. Snake oil cures sold by the bottle, garlic necklaces dangled at doorways, people chewed tobacco and sniffed camphor in desperate superstition. Nothing stopped it. One day you were healthy. The next you felt a chill in your bones, a cough scratching your throat raw. Then fever, delirium, gasping for air, lips turning purple as your lungs filled with fluid faster than your body could clear it. Death came in hours for some, days for others. Sometimes whole families died within days of each other. Father, mother, children, grandparents, neighbors. Orphans wandered streets looking for food while undertakers knocked on doors asking for bodies. By October 1918, the second wave was everywhere and unstoppable. Death tolls rose by the thousands daily. In the United States alone, 195,000 Americans died in October, the deadliest month in the nation's history. The world's dead counted in millions. Soldiers, farmers, dock workers, housewives, priests, school teachers. In Europe's trenches, the virus did what no artillery barrage could do. It broke armies. German troops fell by the tens of thousands, their final offensives strangled by empty ranks and relentless coughing. Allied soldiers dropped in muddy dugouts, not from bullets but from breath. And yet, through it all, the war raged on. Commanders ordered attacks. Politicians spoke of victory. Newspapers were allowed to hint at the horror, but only so much. The censors feared panic more than pestilence. Meanwhile, funerals outnumbered parades. Coffins stacked in churches. Bells tolled without pause. When November came, when the guns finally fell silent at the 11th hour of the 11th day, the war was over, but the flu was not. The armistice meant millions of soldiers going home, taking the virus back to the villages, towns and cities they'd left behind. Back to families that opened their arms for hugs and kisses, and unknowingly, another wave of infection. The second wave would fade by winter, but not before it left millions dead and millions more waiting in dread for what might come next. The first wave warned the world. The second wave punished it for ignoring the warning, and the Spanish flu still wasn't finished. The second wave crested like a black tide, and when it finally began to pull back in late 1918, it left a stunned world, clutching handkerchiefs to their mouths and staring at a truth too big to bury. The Great War was done. The guns of Europe had fallen silent, but silence brought no peace. As the cheering crowds faded and the parades for the returning soldiers turned to funerals, cities and villages alike faced an invisible enemy that refused to sign any armistice. In homes from Boston to Bombay, windows stayed shut, curtains drawn. People feared the air itself. In cities, shopkeepers painted signs, cough and sneeze, cover up. Some restaurants barred anyone without a mask, though those thin gauze squares did little more than give the frightened something to cling to. Teachers taught empty classrooms. Churches sat silent, pews gathering dust while parishioners prayed behind closed doors. Schools closed. Movie houses darkened. Dance halls, once full of laughter and jazz, were padlocked and silent. The sound of life was replaced by the soft roll of funeral carts, the scrape of shovels at mass graves. Superstition rose where science fell silent. Doctors still didn't know what caused it, only that it struck fast and spared no class or color. Newspapers filled with half-truths and folk cures. Some people wore garlic tied around their necks. Others carried camphor balls or packets of asafoetida, pungent lumps tied to belts or pinned to collars. In the countryside, families nailed blankets over doors and windows. Some posted signs, quarantined, keep out. Food was left at gates. Children peered through cracks, watching for neighbors who might bring death to the porch. Yet the world had to keep moving. In some places, quarantines broke under the weight of hunger. Families with no food dared the streets for bread and coal. Nurses, mostly young women, many untrained, moved from house to house, risking their lives with each door they knocked on. In cities like San Francisco, masks became law. Obey the mask ordinance. The papers barked. Wear your mask and save your life. Yet some resisted. The Anti-Mask League of San Francisco rose up, calling face coverings an assault on liberty, a conflict that echoes hauntingly a century later. Doctors, helpless, did what they could. In makeshift wards, they spooned whiskey and castor oil into cracked lips. They packed patients in ice baths. They burned sulfur in sick rooms, hoping the fumes would purify the air. Some tried bleeding, an old medieval cure that only weakened the dying further. But mostly, they waited. Helpless as strong lungs filled with fluid, helpless as young bodies turned blue, helpless as mothers buried children one by one. Whole communities vanished overnight. In Alaska, supply ships found Inuit villages where the living were outnumbered by the dead. Entire families lay frozen in snow-buried huts. No doctors, no graves, no survivors to weep for them. In India, funeral pyres burned day and night. Some cities ran out of wood. Bodies stacked in rivers, drifting past temples where priests chanted for mercy that did not come. British colonial authorities counted the dead by the millions. 12 million gone in months, and that was just the official guess. In South Africa, trains carried the virus deep into mining camps and rural villages where medicine was scarce and fear plentiful. African miners buried their dead in hurried pits before boarding trains that carried the virus further still. In every country, fear turned neighbor against neighbor. Mailmen refused to deliver letters. Police knocked on doors only when the stench of decay warned that no one inside would answer. Orphans wandered streets, begging for bread from strangers who turned away in terror. And yet, amid the fear, small acts of bravery glowed like candles in the dark. Nurses slept in stables and on porches to tend the sick. Volunteers dug graves when the undertakers fell ill. Priests and pastors ignored warnings and stepped through infected doorways to deliver final prayers. The war that ended with a treaty in Paris ended on a date and a signature. The Spanish flu offered no such neat conclusion. No treaty, no hero's welcome, no victory parades. It burned through every continent in waves, sometimes ebbing, sometimes flaring back, until at last it found fewer and fewer new lungs to feed it. By early 1919, the second wave gave way to a third, smaller but still deadly. Then, like a phantom tired of haunting, the virus faded, not because humanity defeated it, but because it had spent its fuel. The world stumbled out of its locked rooms, blinking into the sunlight, half alive, half broken. They would bury the dead, tear down the quarantine notices, sweep out the churches and theaters, and try to pretend it hadn't happened. After all, who would want to remember that the invisible could do what the mighty armies of Europe could not? The world had been locked in fear, and the fear left scars that would echo through generations. A mother with an empty crib, a father with an empty chair at the dinner table, a town with half its graveyard marked 1918. For many, the flu would become a whisper, something spoken of in hushed tones, overshadowed by the war that history found easier to tell. But the virus didn't care about memory. It came, it killed, it left, and it left behind a lesson that the smallest thing in the world can bring the strongest world to its knees. When the last cough quieted and the last fever cooled, the world staggered to its feet and looked around, and the numbers were too large to comprehend. The Spanish flu did not care about flags or borders, kings or beggars. When the final tally came, if it ever truly did, the numbers read like a biblical plague. Sure, at least 50 million dead, maybe more. Some historians argue it might have been as many as 100 million, one in every 20 human beings on Earth. It killed more people in 1 year than the Black Death did in a century. It killed more than World War I's guns, gas, and grenades combined, 3 times over. Soldiers fell at the front lines, yes, but more often they fell in hospital wards and crowded barracks. Young men who never heard the final whistle of the war they were sent to fight. Children who never saw the trenches carried the virus home from schoolyards and spread it at dinner tables. Entire families wiped out in a week. Babies left crying beside mothers too still to hush them. The numbers don't care about borders, but history tries to measure them anyway. In India, an estimated 12 to 17 million dead. Corpses piled along the Ganges, pyres blazing day and night while the colonial administration watched helplessly. In the United States, nearly 675,000 dead, more than all American combat deaths of the 20th century's wars combined. In Europe, already shell-shocked and cratered by the Great War, an extra layer of grief settled over cities already black with mourning bunting. In Africa, the virus swept through labor camps and tribal villages alike. Some communities lost half their people in a season. In the Pacific Islands, Western Samoa, Fiji, entire villages vanished. Ships brought mail and missionaries, and the flu rode with them, finishing what guns and empire started. It preyed on the strong as much as the frail. Most flus kill the very young and the very old. This one broke that rule. It thrived on the young and healthy, soldiers in the prime of life, mothers in their 20s, factory workers, miners, teachers, people whose lungs and immune systems should have protected them. Instead, those strong immune systems overreacted, triggering a violent storm inside the lungs that drowned the body in its own defenses. And it didn't strike just once. Some communities buried their dead after the first wave, only to bury more when the second wave struck in autumn 1918 and then again in early 1919. Cities like New York, London, and Paris became islands of silence, then islands of mourning, then islands of relief, all while distant towns flared up with new outbreaks like embers that refused to die. In many places, the death toll is just a guess. Some remote communities never made it onto the official charts. Families too poor for coffins buried loved ones in backyards, uncounted, unmourned by any ledger but their own memories. And yet the world tried to forget. There were no grand memorials for the victims of the Spanish flu, no marble arches, no annual parades. The dead slipped into family stories, old letters, half-whispered recollections. Mothers spoke of the baby brother who didn't come home. Grandfathers recalled the time the village priest rang the church bell so many times his hands bled. The war heroes got monuments. The flu dead got silence. Why did it vanish so quickly from memory? Maybe because people were tired of death. Maybe because no nation could claim victory over a virus. You can pin medals on soldiers, but who do you decorate for fighting the flu? The nurses who caught it, the doctors who could do nothing, the grieving families who washed the bodies and went back to work? Better, people thought, to bury it along with the bodies. Move forward, build back, hope the next cough would be just a cough. It didn't leave nothing behind, though. In the laboratories of the 1920s and 1930s, young scientists, many of whom had watched helplessly as the flu swept their families, began hunting the virus they couldn't see in 1918. They built the foundations of modern virology. They invented vaccines, learned the secrets of influenza's shape-shifting tricks. They taught the world to watch for the next one. And yet, 100 years later, when another virus came, a different twist of RNA, a different invisible invader, the old lessons echoed back. How fast fear spreads, how easily denial kills, how fragile civilization is when the enemy can hide in a single breath. The Spanish flu's true death toll may never be known, but its lesson stands clear if we dare to look it in the eye. We are small, our certainties are smaller, and the tiniest things in nature can humble the greatest empires we build. When the Spanish flu finally released its grip on a battered world, there was no peace treaty, no day of surrender, no statues cast in bronze, just the silence of empty chairs at dinner tables, fresh mounds of earth in graveyards, and a strange determination to never speak of it again. Unlike the Great War, with its medals, monuments, and speeches of glory, the Spanish flu slipped like a ghost into the attic of history. Most families carried the memory as a private scar, not a public banner. Soldiers got parades and welcome home banners. Survivors of the pandemic got hushed conversations over kitchen tables. Remember when the neighbors all died? And then the silence would return. But the virus left its fingerprints everywhere, whether the world wanted to see them or not. Doctors and scientists who watched helplessly as healthy men and women drowned in their own lungs knew they'd faced an enemy they didn't understand. And so, when the world turned its back on the dead, those doctors turned to microscopes and petri dishes with a vengeance. Before the flu, no one had ever seen a virus. They knew something smaller than bacteria must exist, but it was like studying the wind by watching trees sway. The horror of 1918 sparked a revolution, the race to make the invisible visible. New labs opened, new vaccines were tested. The science of virology was born in the shadows of a pandemic few dared to name. Public health itself changed shape. The Spanish flu taught cities that disease didn't respect class or rank. A rich banker and a poor dock worker coughed the same blood. So public health systems expanded, not overnight, not perfectly, but piece by piece. Quarantine laws, better hospitals, tracking outbreaks, teaching ordinary people that a sneeze could kill, and that fighting disease was not just for doctors, but for everyone. Masks, hand washing, staying home when sick, simple ideas that stuck in the collective memory, only to be dragged out decades later when the next threat came. It also whispered a warning about global connectedness, long before globalization had a name. The steamships and trains that carried young men to the front lines carried the virus home faster than any plague in medieval times ever could. In a few short months, the Spanish flu crossed oceans that once took explorers years to sail. It reminded us that when the world shrinks, so do our chances of outrunning what hunts us. And when airplanes replaced steamships, that warning only grew louder. Yet, despite its scale, the Spanish flu never found a place in our stories. No blockbuster movies in its day, no national memorials, no annual day of mourning. History teachers brushed past it in a paragraph if they mentioned it at all, before moving on to the Roaring Twenties and the crash that followed. Maybe it was too grim, too senseless. A war, at least, could be spun into tales of sacrifice and valor. What heroics can you spin from watching a mother cough herself to the dark while her children huddle under blankets? Who wants to remember that the strongest, healthiest, bravest could drop in days from something you couldn't see? But pandemics have a way of circling back when we forget. A century later, when COVID-19 struck, peeped through old newspapers yellowed with age and saw the headlines rhyme, "Mask up, quarantine, keep your distance." They saw the same debates, freedom versus safety, the same fears, neighbors turning from one another, coffins piling up faster than they could be buried. And suddenly the ghost of 1918 wasn't just a whisper in old family stories. It was a warning that maybe we'd never truly buried. And the virus itself did not vanish. The 1918 flu was an H1N1 strain, a distant ancestor of the flu viruses that still stalk the planet today. Every time we roll up our sleeves for a flu shot, We do so partly because of what that old virus taught us, that influenza never really dies. It hides, it mutates, it waits. Every cough in winter, every news story of a bird flu or swine flu outbreak is a faint echo of the wave that once drowned a third of humanity in fever and fear. The Spanish flu didn't just kill, it humbled. It reminded us that for all our tanks and treaties, sometimes the smallest twist of genetic code can topple empires, halt economies, and leave the world holding its breath for mercy. Its true legacy lives in the questions it left behind. Are we ready for the next one? Will we listen to the warnings? Or will we, like before, bury the dead, tell ourselves it's over, and close the door until the next invisible army comes? So tonight, when you wash your hands, when you feel that winter tickle in your throat, remember, a century ago, millions like you did the same. They covered their coughs, they whispered prayers, and they taught us that survival isn't just about fighting what you can see, it's about respecting what you can't. I'm the Duke of New York. Stay curious, stay brave, and never forget that history's smallest killers are sometimes its greatest teachers.